My name is Elaine Whitmore, and I'm 71 years old. Can you imagine your own son? Someone you carried for 9 months, raised with your own hands, fed with your own spoon, quietly putting something into your evening tea so that, just a few hours later, he could place a pen between your fingers and make you sign away your home, your name, your life. I couldn't either. But that's exactly what happened. I don't remember the papers. I don't remember the conversation. I don't even remember going to bed that night. One moment, I was sitting in my favorite chair in the den, watching the sun sink past the tree line with a warm blanket over my knees, and that familiar creak of the floorboard beneath Jason's footsteps as he came in holding 2 mugs. He said chamomile would help me sleep, that I'd been anxious lately and deserved a good night's rest. His voice was soft, gentle, familiar. I trusted it. I remember the first few sips, how it didn't taste quite right. Too sweet, maybe, or too thick, but I didn't question it. I wanted to believe in comfort. I wanted to believe that after everything I'd been through, someone was finally just taking care of me. And then darkness, no dreams, no tossing or turning, just a full stop, like a curtain had dropped over the inside of my head, and nothing existed behind it. When I woke up, I was in a room I didn't recognize, staring at a ceiling I'd never seen before, with the smell of bleach and old carpet and someone humming down the hall. My clothes were different. My nightstand was gone. The chair wasn't mine, and my house wasn't mine either. The nurse who walked in was kind enough, I suppose, though she spoke to me the way you speak to someone who's lost track of time. She said I'd had a rough few days, that the transition was hard for everyone at first, and that Jason had brought me here himself. Said it was what we had agreed on. I asked her what she meant. Here? What do you mean here? She smiled that soft, practiced smile that nurses wear when they're trying to manage confusion without triggering panic. The facility, she said. Golden Pines. Your new home? I didn't speak for a while after that. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, touching the scratchy blanket, trying to remember anything. I reached for the phone in my purse, but it was gone. So was my wallet, my house keys, my reading glasses. Everything familiar had been stripped away and replaced with carefully labeled shampoo bottles, a cheap wall calendar, and a single framed print of flowers I didn't recognize. I asked the nurse again if I could speak to my son, and she said he had left just that morning after getting everything settled. When I asked what exactly he had settled, she handed me a folder. Inside was a copy of the paperwork, signed by me. It said I had agreed to transfer full ownership of the property to Jason Whitmore and had requested placement in long-term care. My signature was at the bottom, 3 times. I stared at those shaky letters, my name in my own hand, and felt something ice-cold wrap around the base of my spine, because I had no memory of writing those words. None, not even a flicker. The rest of the day passed like molasses through a cracked jar. Slow, sticky, messy. I didn't know who to call. I didn't even know what to ask. The other women here were kind, but tired, lost in their own little fogs. One asked me 3 times if I was new. Another offered me her extra applesauce cup. No one asked what had brought me here, because everyone assumed the answer was the same: age, decline, inevitability. But that wasn't what brought me here. What brought me here was a cup of tea. At first, I tried to tell myself it was stress, that maybe I really had agreed to all this and just didn't remember, that maybe time had finally started to take something from me like it always does eventually. But deep down, I knew something didn't feel right. The body remembers things the mind forgets, and mine was on edge. I felt it in the way my fingers twitched when I looked at those signatures, in the way my chest tightened every time someone called this place home, in the way I caught myself flinching whenever someone mentioned my son's name with warmth. I didn't want to believe Jason would do something so calculated, so cruel. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mug of tea, saw the way he set it down with such care, saw his eyes watching me as I drank it, not lovingly, but intently, like he was waiting for something. The nurses told me I had been here for 3 days, but it felt like more. Time moved differently in a place like this. Meals came on schedule, medications were handed out like clockwork, and there was always someone knocking before you could finish a thought. The first night, I asked for a phone call. The nurse said Jason had filled out a no-contact form for your safety, she said, and that all communications had to go through him. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just nodded and smiled and folded my hands in my lap. But inside, something snapped. My own son was filtering my voice. I wasn't a patient here. I was a prisoner. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, before the staff had made their rounds, and wandered down to the little community room where they kept the newspapers and puzzles. There was a small television in the corner, muted, showing a local news station. And that's when I saw it. Jason, standing beside a woman in a sleek navy suit, holding a pair of ceremonial scissors, grinning like a man who'd just won something. The headline at the bottom read, "Jason Whitmore donates family home to launch housing project." I stared at the screen, breath caught in my throat, as they panned over a crowd of smiling people gathered on the front lawn of what used to be my home, my porch, my roses, my blue shutters. He hadn't just taken the house, he turned it into a victory lap. I stood there for a long time, not blinking, not moving, just watching the loop repeat as the camera showed the inside of my old kitchen, now painted white with stainless steel appliances, stripped of its history and staged like a catalog. And in that moment, I felt something shift, not grief, not confusion, but fury, cold, silent fury. Later that day, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No return address, just my name, written in pen. Inside was a single photo. Blurry, but clear enough. It was Jason's car, parked outside a pharmacy I didn't recognize. On the back, in unfamiliar handwriting, were 3 words. He planned everything. I didn't know who had sent it or how they had reached me, but it told me what I needed to hear. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't broken. I had been played, and I wasn't going to sit quietly and let him get away with it. I had never hired a private investigator before, and the idea of doing so from a locked-down facility without a phone or even access to my bank account seemed like something out of a bad TV movie. But when someone takes your life away from you one quiet signature at a time, you start to realize how far you're willing to go just to get a piece of it back. I waited until the evening shift came on. The younger nurse, the one who always left her clipboard unattended by the door, and I slipped a single note onto her cart, folded tight, nothing but a name and a number, written on the back of an old crossword puzzle I had stolen from the library cart 3 days earlier. The name was Charles Deacon. The number, scribbled from memory, was one my husband had once used when he was handling estate matters. I had no idea if it still worked. I just hoped. 3 days passed. No mention of the note. No word. No change. I started to wonder if she'd thrown it out or, worse, handed it to Jason. If my son was already planning how to tighten the walls around me further. I tried to act normal, joined the morning bingo game, complimented the tuna casserole, smiled during group exercise, just to keep the staff off guard. But inside, I was unraveling, one stitch at a time. Then, on the 4th day, a woman named Diana came to visit. She said she was from a local church outreach, that she brought gifts to new residents. She carried a small basket of lavender soap, a Bible I wouldn't read, and a card tucked in the back flap with a single sentence written in pencil. "You were right. He drugged the tea." It hit me so hard, I almost dropped the basket. I excused myself and went straight to my room. That night, under the blanket with the curtain pulled shut, I found a second note taped inside the battery compartment of the soap dish. It was from Charles. He was alive, still working, still sharp. He wrote that he'd looked into Jason's pharmacy purchases and found a record of a special order, an herbal blend, that included not only concentrated chamomile, but also a compound called doxylamine succinate, commonly used in sleep aids. The order had been placed 3 days before I signed the house documents. He was already planning it. Charles said he'd gone to the notary's office where the transfer was filed, and that while the video recording had been deleted, conveniently overwritten, the receptionist remembered me. She said I looked off, tired, distant, like someone just going through the motions. Then came the worst part. Jason had filed a separate document that day, an affidavit from a licensed psychologist stating that I was exhibiting early-stage cognitive decline and was acting on impulse, possibly under duress. But that same psychologist had no record of ever speaking with me because we never met. The signature, paid for, the statement, fabricated. Jason hadn't just tricked me. He built an entire lie around me. Charles ended his note with a question. "Are you ready to move forward? I have everything we need, but it won't be quiet." I didn't hesitate. I wrote back the next morning on the back of a Sudoku sheet, handed it to Diana during her next church visit, and watched her walk calmly back through the automatic doors, like she was just another well-meaning volunteer. But in that moment, I knew this wasn't over, not even close. There's a kind of silence that follows betrayal, not the shocked, gasping kind, but something slower, heavier, like when the wind dies down before a storm hits and all you can hear is your own heartbeat pulsing in your ears. That's what it felt like when Charles sent me the flash drive. It came in a bar of soap, hollowed out and resealed with heat, slipped to me during Diana's third visit. I didn't know what it would show, but my hands shook when I pulled it out, because I already knew what it had to be. He wouldn't risk that much for nothing. The facility had one public computer for resident email access, though most of the women here used it to look at photos of their grandkids or print out recipes they'd never cook again. I waited until the tech volunteer, some boy barely 20 with too many tattoos and not enough supervision, was distracted by his phone. I said I had an old tax file to double check, and he didn't even blink. I plugged in the flash drive and clicked the folder labeled Tuesday. And then I saw it. The video opened with a timestamp in the corner, the exact date I was told I had signed over the house. The footage was from a camera above the notary's desk, grainy but clear. I watched myself shuffle in behind Jason, my coat slipping off one shoulder, my eyes half-lidded, mouth slightly open like I'd just woken up. Jason pulled out a chair and gently guided me into it, his hand hovering behind my back, like I might fall over if he didn't keep me upright. I didn't look drunk. I didn't look tired. I looked drugged. The notary said something I couldn't hear. There was no audio, but Jason leaned in close, said a few words, smiled, and handed over the documents. I took the pen, slowly, awkwardly, and scrawled my name where he pointed. Not once, not twice, 3 times, each signature shakier than the last. At one point, I dropped the pen. Jason picked it up, put it back in my hand, and steadied my wrist. It was like watching a puppet show where I was the one with strings tied to my fingers. The notary never questioned it, never asked me anything directly. She kept her eyes on Jason the whole time. When it was done, he gave her a firm handshake, slipped something into her palm. I couldn't make it out, and then gently led me out of frame. I watched the entire thing with my mouth open, frozen, unable to breathe. Charles had also included scanned copies of the affidavit and a digital signature analysis showing my baseline handwriting compared to the ones on the documents. The report was damning. Whoever reviewed it would see it wasn't natural movement. It was coerced. The psychologist's statement was flagged too. Fake license number, no verifiable practice, no billing history for any appointments with me. In other words, it was all smoke and mirrors. Jason hadn't just fooled me. He had engineered an entire reality around me, brick by brick, so that when I finally looked up, I wouldn't recognize the world I was living in. He didn't want me to just lose the house. He wanted me to question my own memory, my own sanity, to doubt myself just enough that I'd never think to fight back. But he'd made one mistake. He didn't finish the job. I was still here, still breathing, still watching. When someone takes everything from you, the worst thing you can do is let them think you're broken. That's what I kept reminding myself every morning as I folded the same thin blanket over my lap and stared out the same smudged window at the same patch of weeds someone had tried to call a garden. I kept my face calm and my tone light. I made small talk with the staff, nodded during group therapy, smiled when Jason sent his bi-weekly checking-in voicemail that always started with, "Hey Mom, hope you're settling in okay," as if this whole situation was some peaceful retirement plan we had arranged together over brunch. But inside, I was gathering every piece of strength I had left. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to storm in and accuse. I was going to build something slow and solid, something that couldn't be ignored or twisted, something that even Jason's smug little lawyer couldn't dismantle. Charles said the best revenge is built like a house, brick by brick, with permits in order and foundation deep. So that's what we did. First, we filed a quiet petition for a mental competency evaluation, voluntary, through an outside geriatric specialist Charles trusted from a previous case. The doctor came in as a grief counselor, spent 2 full afternoons talking with me about memory, judgment, history, current events, and after I aced every cognitive test she placed in front of me, she agreed to put it in writing. I was of sound mind, period. Second, Charles drafted a formal revocation of the property transfer on the basis of fraud and incapacity. But we weren't going to file it just yet. Not until every piece was in place. The next part was harder. I had to record myself. There was a laptop hidden in a book cart Diana wheeled in every Thursday, buried under a pile of old Reader's Digests. She wheeled it into my room, left it beside my chair, and gave me an hour. I sat there with the webcam pointed at my face, hands folded, voice shaking but steady. I told my story, start to finish. The tea, the blank night, the moment I woke up in someone else's bed, the feeling of being erased. I showed the medical documents, the handwriting comparison, the fake affidavit. I named names, dates. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I just told the truth, clear, firm, undeniable. Then I saved the file, encrypted it, and sent it to 3 separate locations. Charles's office, a backup legal server, and a USB key Diana promised to mail to my niece in Chicago. After that, I wrote a letter to Jason. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't contain threats or insults. Just a quiet page of facts, ending with a single line. I know what you did, and you're going to return everything, or I will. I didn't sign it with love. I didn't sign it at all. We waited a week, then 2. I kept pretending, kept smiling, but every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, I felt my pulse quicken. Charles said the moment would come, one way or another, but I didn't expect it to come like it did. Not with flowers, not with apologies, not with a voice that shook. But that part comes later. For now, I had everything in place: proof, paperwork, medical confirmation, and a backup plan in case anything went wrong. I was no longer waiting to be rescued. I had become the storm. I was sitting in the common room pretending to work through a crossword puzzle I had already finished twice before, mostly to keep my hands busy and my expression neutral, when I heard his voice at the front desk. Smooth and familiar. Too relaxed for someone who hadn't visited his mother in weeks, especially not after quietly shipping her off to a nursing home and pretending it was done out of care. My fingers froze over the newspaper as I tilted my head just slightly, catching the nurse's voice as she said his name, her tone polite but uncertain, the kind of forced friendliness people use when they're unsure whether the person they're speaking to is family or a threat. I barely had time to breathe before I saw him, Jason, standing right there in the doorway like nothing had happened, holding a cheap bouquet of gas station flowers that were already starting to wilt, smiling that same calculated smile he wore whenever he needed something or had something to hide. He walked toward me as if the past month had been a misunderstanding, as if I didn't know what he had done, as if I hadn't seen the video footage of him steadying my drugged hand as I signed away the deed to the home I had lived in for over 40 years, as if I hadn't already read the fake affidavit or learned about the sleeping compounds he slipped into my tea just days before he marched me into that notary office with a quiet, guiding voice and a calmness that now made my skin crawl. He leaned down and tried to hug me like a dutiful son, like I was just his sweet old mother enjoying a peaceful retirement, and I let him, not because I wanted to, but because I needed him to believe, for just a few more minutes, that I hadn't already dismantled every lie he'd built brick by brick. He sat beside me, still wearing that infuriating calm, and started talking, launching into a well-rehearsed speech about how things got out of hand, how none of it was meant to hurt me, how he'd simply done what he thought was best for the family, like stealing my home, erasing my name, and shoving me into a facility without my consent was just an unfortunate byproduct of some noble sacrifice he had made on behalf of the greater good. I sat there quietly for several minutes, letting him talk, watching the way his hands fidgeted slightly despite the practiced tone of his voice, and I didn't speak, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to watch him sweat, to let the silence stretch long enough that it began to eat at his confidence. And when I finally did speak, it was only to ask, in the calmest voice I could muster, whether he would like a cup of tea. The question caught him off guard. He blinked, nodded slowly, and said sure, probably thinking that maybe, just maybe, he still had a thread of control left to pull. So I stood up, walked to the small kitchenette on the other side of the room, filled the electric kettle, and waited for it to boil while keeping my eyes on him the entire time, not with warmth or affection, but with the cold, steady gaze of a woman who has seen exactly what her child is capable of and has chosen not to flinch anymore. I returned with 2 mugs and placed one in front of him without a word, then sat back down and stared straight into his eyes as I delivered a single sentence. Soft, even, but packed with more weight than any scream. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." The change in his expression was almost immediate. He didn't sip the tea. He didn't blink. The color drained from his face, like someone had opened a valve behind his ears, and he leaned forward, about to speak, about to grasp at some final string of manipulation he thought might still work. But whatever clever excuse or flimsy justification he had prepared was nowhere to be found in that moment. And instead, for the first time since this all began, I watched him falter. Not in anger or arrogance, but in fear. He said my name, called me Mom, softly, like it would fix something. And for the briefest second, I felt something inside me waver, because no matter how far someone falls, when it's your child sitting there looking at you like they're lost, something in your chest always aches. But then I remembered the way I had woken up with no memory, the way I had been carted away from my own home like I was already dead, the way he had looked straight into the camera and guided my hand across those documents like I was just a thing to be used. And in that instant, whatever softness had dared to return turned to ash, and I stood up slowly, told him I needed to rest, and walked away without looking back. Not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because I knew that whatever came next would hit him harder than anything I could ever say. He wasn't scared of my words, but soon he would be terrified of my silence. There's a strange kind of calm that settles deep in your chest once you realize the storm you've feared isn't on its way, it's already here. And instead of drowning in it, you're the one steering the current with steady hands and quiet rage. And that was exactly how I felt the week after Jason's visit, when Charles filed the motion and began dismantling, piece by piece, the rotten foundation of the life my son had tried to build on a lie so cruel that even now, as I write this, I still can't fully wrap my head around how easily he played the role of concerned child while selling my world out from under me. It began small, almost disappointingly so, with a set of certified letters, one sent to Jason's law office, another to the real estate agent handling the sale of my house, and a third to the notary who had so willingly looked past my dazed eyes and wavering pen strokes to validate what should have never been considered a legal document. And though the letters themselves were calm and formal, each word was soaked in evidence and weight, with attachments and affidavits and timelines that no one could ignore or explain away. At first, there was silence, that kind of calculated stillness that people like Jason rely on while they figure out their next move. But Charles had predicted that too. And so, he didn't wait. He filed a motion to freeze all property transfers tied to my address, and within 24 hours, the sale listing was pulled from every website, and Jason's smug plan to profit off the home I had built with my own hands vanished from the market like it had never existed in the first place. Meanwhile, the forensic accountant we'd hired began his slow, deliberate tracing of the insurance payout, and what he found wasn't just unethical, it was nauseating. Because the money had been funneled into a joint account held by Jason and Rachel, his wife, who until now had pretended to know nothing, keeping her distance like the good, supportive spouse, yet somehow had no issue signing for the second car, or posting smiling vacation selfies from a beachfront condo that was paid for with the remains of my stolen future. But as much as the money made me sick, it wasn't what unraveled them. It was the video, that single, shaky piece of footage captured by Charles's investigator during the falsified signing, paired with the fake psychological documents and my voluntary mental health evaluation from a licensed specialist, formed a chain of proof so airtight that even Jason's firm couldn't shield him for long. And once it hit the right inboxes, it didn't take more than a week for the first journalist to reach out, then the podcast host who covered elder fraud. Then the quiet buzz on social media that began to frame my son's face, not as a grieving, concerned child, but as a cold-blooded manipulator who used his mother's trust like a shovel to dig her legal grave. Within 2 days, Jason was placed on leave from the firm, and Rachel's license as a notary went under formal review. Their world which had seemed so perfectly curated in photos and brunch tables and staged smiles, was now cracking under the weight of truth they had worked so hard to bury. Still, the moment that truly marked the collapse didn't come through a courtroom or a headline. It came through a quiet phone call, one I received late at night from a number I didn't recognize, though something in my gut told me it was him even before I answered. And sure enough, there he was, voice soft and low, asking if it was me, calling me Mom, like that word still held power, like he hadn't burned it to ash with every lie. And for a few seconds, I let the silence stretch between us, because I wanted him to sit in it, to feel how hollow it had all become. And when he finally said he was sorry, not with confidence, not with pride, but like someone who had finally come to realize the depth of what they'd done, I simply replied that we had already talked. And then, without another word, I ended the call. Because apologies are for accidents, and what he did was a decision. There's a very particular kind of silence that lives inside an empty house, especially one that's been stripped of its soul by someone who once called you family. And when I finally stepped through the front door of my own home again, keys returned to my hand, locks rekeyed, title restored in full. It wasn't the absence of furniture or the way the echo of my footsteps bounced against bare walls that struck me most, but the strange, weightless ache of realizing how much had been taken without a single physical bruise, because what Jason stole wasn't just wood and windows. It was the memory of birthdays in the kitchen, of my late husband's laugh in the den, of 1,000 quiet moments that made this house something more than a legal asset. And though I stood there in an empty living room, no longer filled with any of my things, I felt more at home than I had in years, not because of what was there, but because of what I had reclaimed. The process of getting it back hadn't been dramatic. There were no grand court speeches or slammed gavels, but rather a steady march of paperwork, frozen accounts, quietly terrified depositions, and finally, a judge's order that restored everything Jason had tried to erase. And when it was done, when the fight was over and the house was legally, permanently mine again, I didn't cry or cheer or call anyone. I just asked Diana to drive me there. And when she handed me the keys, with a little smile and a tight hug, I took them with both hands and promised her and myself that I would never again hand over my life out of trust without making sure it had been earned. The news of the judgment never made national headlines, and that was fine by me. The local station did a quiet story on elder fraud, using my experience anonymously as an example of the kind of manipulation that can happen behind closed doors, and a few neighbors dropped off casseroles or left flowers on the porch, unsure of whether I wanted to talk, and I appreciated the gesture. But what I needed most wasn't conversation, it was space. So I spent the first few weeks sitting in the garden with a cup of tea that I brewed myself, watching the sunlight move across the grass, and listening to the wind hit the wind chimes I'd rehung outside the kitchen window. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel during the chaos. Peace. Jason never tried to contact me again. Not after the house was taken back. Not after the investigation into Rachel's notary license resulted in her suspension. Not after his own firm quietly let him go to avoid any public mess. And not even when I heard from a friend of a friend that he'd moved to a rental apartment 2 towns over and was trying to rebuild his career under a different practice. And though there were moments when I caught myself wondering what he must have been thinking, whether he regretted anything or simply hated me now for ruining his plan, I always came back to the same thought. The person who once sat at my kitchen table eating my food and laughing at my stories had died long before he ever filed that claim. And what remained wasn't someone I needed in my life. One afternoon, I found a box in the attic, one he hadn't touched, filled with old photographs, birthday cards, and a few crayon drawings from when Jason was still small. And for a while, I just sat on the floor with it in my lap, unsure of what to feel, but eventually I realized I wasn't sad. Not in the way I feared I would be. I was just done hoping he'd change, done grieving a version of him that no longer existed, done waiting for closure that would never come with a phone call or apology. The closure had already happened the moment I said no, not out of anger, but from the kind of strength that comes when you finally understand your worth and know it's not up for negotiation. I didn't need revenge. I just needed my name back, and I got it. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, through the betrayal, the silence, the fight, and the quiet return, it's that you are never too old to take back your story. Never too far gone to stand up and say, "This is mine." Whether it's your home, your name, your dignity, or simply the right to decide where and how your life goes next, because people may underestimate you when your hair turns gray or your steps slow down, but that doesn't mean your voice stops mattering. And sometimes, when the dust settles and you're finally able to sit in your own chair with the sunlight hitting your face just right, you realize that starting over at 67 isn't something to be feared. It's something to be proud of. So if you're still here with me, thank you for listening. Thank you for walking through this story. And if it meant something to you or reminded you of someone you love, don't forget to subscribe, because I've lived a long life filled with quiet battles and small victories, and I've still got stories to tell. And maybe, just maybe, one of them might sound a little like yours.